Alrighty, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I'm going to dive right into part 6, where we're finishing up seeded plants. Last I talked about gymnosperms. I'm putting these videos out about the same time, so if you missed it, take a look at that one first. Just in addition to what I was talking about last, these are images of pollen grains. And remember how I said that a lot of them have these cool shapes? This is in order for the wind to be able to catch them and carry them more easily, or in some cases it might want to stick to an animal, so it might have these little spiky appendages or protrusions in order to kind of stick to the animal. That way pollination happens easier. And we'll talk about this class, how that works. So we're going to talk mostly about flowering plants, but we're going to talk about the advantages that come with this, because a lot of the systems between angiosperms and gymnosperms are very similar to each other. However, there are distinct advantages, and we see this in the number of flowering plants versus the number of cone plants. We have things like pine trees that fit in the cone plants, but in terms of flowering plants, there's way more that we can see here in, say, even just Vancouver. So advantages of flowers. So advantages of flowers. Main thing is it attracts bees, moths, insects, birds, etc. So why is this a good thing? Well, what ends up happening is they move generally from flower to flower. So if you're moving from flower to flower, you're going to pick up pollen from one plant, and then you're going to, from one flower, and then you're going to move to a different flower, perhaps on a different plant. You're going to have a bit of this pollen on you. Some of it's going to get all over your outer coat. If you've ever seen bees, when they're actually moving from flower to flower, a lot of them are covered in this sort of yellow pollen powder or dust. Now, some of that is going to get deposited in the new flowers that they land on. So this process makes pollination very efficient. Before, we relied on the wind to pollinate, which wind can blow them any which way. The plant has no control over it. However, with flowers, they can grow and shape themselves and create a certain scent that'll attract different insects, so they can have a little bit more power, and it's way more efficient, so they have to put much less energy into producing pollen. Oftentimes, cone producing plants have to make a lot of pollen in order to hope to get a successful fertilization. So then the second part, a lot of these plants will have a second part. So they'll have something called a fruit, which is soft tissue surrounding seeds. Now, why is this good? It's actually good for a very similar reason. It attracts animals. Now we have to think, natural selection chooses based on the environment which creatures get to survive. So obviously there is something about creating fruit that is beneficial, or else it would not be successful and it would not be present. But you have to put a lot of energy into fruits. So something has to be beneficial to this in order for it to work, because it takes energy, it's not free to do, there has to be some benefit. And I'm going to draw a little diagram. If we had, say, a tree, and then it didn't produce fruit, it just dropped its seeds. So I'm going to put the seeds as little green dots. If this just released seeds for, say, the wind, what's probably going to happen is your tree is going to be here, and all the seeds are going to be very close around it. They're basically going to fall straight down. Can anyone see the problem yet? I kind of put the problem in with this, but if we imagine, I go over a little bit, and some of these seeds won't take, but some of them will. So I'll draw a bunch of little ones. And maybe you can start to see the issue is you have all these plants growing right around the parent plant. This results in competition. This is where we get into the idea of survival of the fittest. Ideally, the parent tree wants as many of these plants to survive as possible. In its current setup, it is actually competing against its own offspring for water, for resources, for sunlight. So seeds attract animals. Animals tend to eat the fruit and then move away. So they might eat the seeds and then poop out the seeds later. But what this results in, if instead of making a bunch, I just have a few fruits, then the seeds may end up over here, over here, over here, which results in the parent tree not having to compete with its offspring and spreads them out more, so there's less competition. Kind of the cool thing about this competition, spelling. Cool thing about this year, when we've been talking about evolution, we can really think about how everything serves some sort of purpose. Everything has to fit this concept of natural selection. Things like growing fruit, it really doesn't seem that huge to us when we think about it without thinking about it. But if we take a moment to think about it, it's amazing how putting that much energy into something can have a benefit in the long run. But we can see that this is actually the case because so many plants produce fruits. And again, the plant has some control over what kind of animals eat the plant, or the fruit, sorry. It can create fruits that are small, like little berries for birds to eat, or it can create larger fruits. Alright, next up, we have angiosperm classification. So there's a couple of different types. First type I'll talk about is monocot and dicot. So I actually have an image to show for that. It's rather technical, but basically monocots are on the tops, dicots are on the bottom. So splitting it up, you can see monocots generally have the sort of layout where they have something called a cotyledon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The veins are usually parallel on their leaves. So on this image you can see that there's lines going all in the same direction. The vascular bundles are usually complexly arranged. It has a fibrous root system, and the floral plants usually in multiples of 3. For dicots, it has 2. The veins are usually net-like, so they kind of branch out. Vascular bundles are usually arranged in a ring. The taproots are usually present, so you can see that there's a slightly different design. That there's one central root that spreads out, whereas with the fibrous root system, there's no one central root system. And floral parts usually in multiples of 4 or 5. So main things for you to look at if you're out and about and exploring is, well, go with the things that you can see the easiest. You'll be able to see the leaves, and you'll be able to see the flowers if it's the right time of year. If you're trying to look for these, you can't really do it without killing the plant, and this is related to seeds. Oops, related to seeds. So you can use this to help you kind of, when you're looking at a plant, figure out which type it is. Other parts that are important, woody and herbaceous. I've actually got a video that I'm going to show about this. I'm going to link to in the description, but woody refers to hard structures. Generally, it is wood. So things like trees are woody plants. Herbaceous is any sort of soft, flexible tissue. So when you think of a plant like grass, it would be herbaceous because it doesn't have any firm structure to it, or most flowers. This plays a part in whether or not a plant is an annual, a biennial, or a perennial. So you may have heard of annuals and perennials if you've been around to a flower shop, but I'll talk about what those are in a moment. But basically, woody plants have a much easier time surviving harsh climates or surviving over winter for multiple seasons or years, whereas herbaceous plants generally can't deal with freezing weather, so herbaceous tissue generally will die off if it gets too cold. So most trees, like deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the winter, the leaves part of them are herbaceous, whereas the rest of the structure would be considered woody. So this comes in with annuals, biennials, and perennials. So annuals, they have their life cycle in 1 year. So they go from sprout to flowers to pollinating to seeds, and then they die in 1 growing season. Biennials, the same thing happens in 2 years. So I'm gonna have to spread out a little bit, but year 1 is generally the sprout, stem, maybe leaves, maybe not. Year 2 is leaves, flowers, seeds, and dies. Perennials we generally say they're woody, or they have woody stems. That way they can survive multiple years. They have herbaceous leaves which die in winter. So a lot of flowering plants will have this sort of cycle, and they can keep growing flowers each year because they've got this sort of woody structure that keeps their core alive while getting rid of the stuff that isn't able to survive season to season. Alright, structure of flowers. I will move this over here. Some of them have different names. You might have heard of things like the pistil, but there's the sepals and petals. So sepals are the little green leaves that kind of surround the flower. The petals are the large, colorful, very soft structures that surround it. The sepals are for protection. If you've seen a flower when it's not open, or when it hasn't opened, it is generally covered by these. The petals are for attracting animals. Stamens are the male part. They have a few parts. They've got the filament, which is the long tube coming up, and then they've got the anther. So this is where the pollen is, and there's generally a bunch of them around the outside. Next up, there is the carpel, which is this whole structure here. So this is the female part of the flower. So it has the pollen tube, the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. In terms of variety of flowers, part of it I showed over here, but generally I'll leave that part to you. You can see just by walking around how many different types of flowers there are. Okay, last bit. I know this video is a little bit on the long side. Life cycle of an angiosperm. They are sporophyte dominant. So they are large, independent, photosynthetic, long-lasting, and very multicellular. Flowers are the sporophyte structures, but they are where the meiosis happens and produce gametophytes. So again, same with gymnosperms. The male gametophytes will make sperm and pollen grain, or they're called the pollen grains, and the female gametophytes are called the embryo sacs, which will make the eggs. And this happens inside the ovules of flowers, so inside this area right here. Pollination is the transfer of pollen to the female parts, and it can happen by one or two methods. So it can happen by wind pollinating flowers. So they generally have very boring flowers. They look almost cone-like. I've got one right here, and they make a lot of pollen. So here is actually it producing and using wind to blow all of this as pollen, which again leads to allergies. Animal pollinated plants, so they attract animals. So here are some examples of animals that pollinate. And again, if I zoom in here, you can see the bee is covered in all of this little like yellow dust that you see on it is pollen from either this flower or other flowers. So fertilization, so if pollen grain lands on the stigma, it'll grow a pollen tube. The other cell forms two sperm nuclei. So this is exactly what happens in the gymnosperms. However, there's a couple of things. One part, the other sperm fertilizes two female haploid cells at the same time, and it produces this weird triploid cell. So triploids are actually 3N. They have 3 sets of chromosomes. The triploid cell divides to become the endosperm tissue, the food source around the embryo for the seed, and the other two are called a double fertilization, so the seed coat forms around the embryo to protect it. So complicated, but I'll show you what is happening. So I'm going to focus on this part right here. Basically, this is the egg producing, this is the pollen, so fertilization happens here. The zygote is forming, but there is this 3N endosperm. What ends up happening is one of those ends up becoming the food supply for the zygote, which then forms into this seed, which is then spread around either by a fruit or by wind, and then the life cycle continues. I'm trying to give this in a quick way. I will be posting this whole note set now, so you'll have it to refer to. I know this is a lot of information. I know it's not as great as if we were in class, but this is basically the end for plants. I have a few other lessons or videos that I'd like to make if I have the time. But generally speaking, this is the major information for the course. So hopefully you found it enjoyable. I know it would have been great to have this in class. I had a lot of samples that I would have liked to have shown you, but a lot of this stuff you can also see and make connections to in your own time. So again, thank you for joining me if you've been following along this long. Take care, stay safe, have a great summer, have a good one.